In World War II, a sidearm was your absolute last line of defense in a muddy trench. Today, we are ranking every major service pistol and revolver of the Second World War. We will go from the absolute worst battlefield liabilities to the undisputed kings of combat. Let's begin the countdown. Kicking off our list at number 35 is the United States FP45 Liberator. This was a stamped sheet metal box dropped to resistance fighters. It was a smooth-bore, single-shot weapon that lacked any real accuracy. The loading process was incredibly slow and clumsy under pressure. It literally took longer to reload this gun than it took to manufacture it. It was a psychological tool rather than a true combat pistol. Next up is the Japanese Type 94 Nambu. This is widely considered the most dangerous pistol for the user to carry. It featured an exposed sear bar on the left side of the frame. If you bumped it against your gear, the gun would immediately fire. You never even had to touch the trigger to cause an accidental discharge. It was a disastrous flaw for a military sidearm. Moving on to the Italian Glissenti Model 1910. This pistol was originally chambered in the weak 9mm Glissenti cartridge. The fatal flaw was its magazine dimensions, which accepted standard 9mm parabellum ammo perfectly. Firing that hotter ammunition would violently tear the weak receiver apart. This catastrophic failure made it a deadly trap for uninformed soldiers. It was eventually replaced by much safer Italian designs. Next is the Japanese Type 26 revolver. This was a total relic from the 19th century still seeing combat. It featured a grueling double-action-only trigger pull that exhausted the shooter. It also had an incredibly weak cylinder lockup that spun freely when decocked. These massive flaws destroyed any chance of accuracy in a frantic firefight. It was hopelessly outgunned by modern semi-automatic pistols. Let's look at the Czechoslovakian CZ-VZ-38. This was an overly bulky and heavy, double-action-only pistol. It was chambered in a relatively weak 380 ACP cartridge. German troops were often forced to carry it as a substitute weapon. They universally disliked it due to its terrible, clunky ergonomics. The incredibly stiff trigger pull made hitting a target very difficult. Coming in next is the Italian Bodio Model 1889. This was a rugged but utterly obsolete revolver design. It originally dated all the way back to the black powder era. Somehow, it was still seeing frontline combat in the early 1940s. It featured a folding trigger on certain models that was awkward to deploy. It was completely outclassed by the weapons of the Allied forces. Next up is the Soviet Korovin TK. This was a tiny pocket pistol meant purely for civilians and staff officers. It fired an extremely underpowered 6.35mm cartridge. The weapon was completely useless for actual frontline combat against enemy troops. It could never reliably stop a charging soldier in thick winter clothing. It was strictly a badge of authority rather than a combat tool. Moving down the list is the French Ruby pistol. These were cheap Spanish blowback pistols produced in massive numbers for World War I. They were pulled out of storage to fight in the Second World War. They suffered from completely terrible and inconsistent manufacturing tolerances. A magazine from one Ruby pistol often would not fit inside another. This made field maintenance an absolute nightmare for French soldiers. Next, we have the British Enfield No. 2 Mark I. Specifically, we are looking at the notorious Tinkeroo variant. It had its hammer spur completely removed to prevent snagging inside tight armor compartments. This modification forced the gun to operate as double action only. That heavy trigger pull made it nearly impossible to shoot accurately under extreme stress. It was a compromise that severely hurt combat performance. Next is the Soviet Nagant M1895. This revolver is highly famous for its unique gas seal cylinder. This rare feature meant it could actually be effectively fitted with a silencer. However, its general combat effectiveness was ruined by an agonizingly slow loading gate. It also required a massive 20-pound trigger pull to fire in double action. Unloading empty casings one by one was lethal in a fast firefight. Let's continue with the Japanese Type 14 Nambu. This was the standard Japanese officer sidearm throughout the entire war. It suffered from a highly brittle firing pin that broke very often. It also had terrible magazine retention issues when the release button was bumped. Finally, it relied on the incredibly weak 8mm Nambu cartridge. It was a highly flawed weapon that failed to meet military standards. Next up is the French Maybal DD. This was a functional but entirely unexceptional blowback pistol. It was chambered in the small .32 ACP caliber. It worked reliably enough in the field for police and security forces. However, it severely lacked the stopping power needed for heavy military use. It was quickly overshadowed by more powerful handguns of the era. Moving on to the Belgian FN model 1910/22. This was a very reliable John Browning striker fire design. It was widely issued to various European police and military forces, but it featured virtually non-existent iron sights that hindered aiming. It was also chambered for very weak ammunition types like .32 ACP. It functioned well, but was far too weak for the main battlefields. Next is the Hungarian FG-37M. This was a very sturdy and exceptionally well-built weapon. It proved to be highly reliable in muddy and dirty conditions, but it was still relegated to the underpowered 380 ACP round. This specific caliber made it far too weak for dedicated military combat against riflemen. It was an excellent design held back by its ammunition. Let's look at the Czechoslovakian CZ-27. This was a beautifully machined and incredibly simple blowback pistol. It was widely utilized by German police forces after the occupation. Rear echelon troops also carried it heavily throughout the entire war. It was highly dependable and easy to maintain in the field. But just like many others, it lacked real knockdown power. Next up is the United States Colt M1903 pocket hammerless. It was extremely sleek, completely snag-free, and highly concealable. It became highly beloved by Allied generals as a personal defense weapon. General George Patton famously carried one with ivory grips. However, it fired a weak caliber that was totally unsuited for infantry combat. It completely lacked the stopping power needed for actual trench clearing. Coming in next is the Italian Beretta M1934 and M1935. These compact pistols were virtually jam-proof in harsh desert conditions. This incredible reliability came directly from their signature open-slide design. But they were significantly held back in combat by a low 7-round capacity. They also fired very weak calibers that struggled to stop threats instantly. They were beautiful guns, but underpowered for global warfare. Next, we have the French model 1935A and 1935S. These pistols featured phenomenal ergonomics and great mechanical accuracy. They were an absolute joy to shoot on the training range. Sadly, the French military totally crippled their combat potential. They specifically chambered them in the weak 7.65mm Longu round. A better caliber would have made them top-tier combat handguns. Let's continue with the German Mauser HSC. This was a highly advanced double-action pocket pistol designed to compete with Walther. It looked incredibly sleek and modern for its time. However, its unique shrouded hammer design was a major tactical flaw. It made the gun very susceptible to trapping dirt and mud on the battlefield. It was a brilliant civilian gun that struggled in military service. Next is the German Sauer 38H. This pistol featured a brilliant concealed internal hammer design. It also had an advanced cocking and decocking lever on the frame. It was truly ahead of its time for handgun safety technology, but the internal parts were simply too complex and delicate for harsh battlefield conditions. When it got dirty, it was prone to highly complicated malfunctions. Moving on to the British Webley Mark IV and Mark VI. These were rugged, incredibly hard-hitting revolvers used across the British Empire. They featured a fast-ejecting top-break action for much quicker reloads. They were absolutely fantastic weapons for brutal close-quarters combat, but they were just too bulky and heavy for a standard sidearm. They were simply slower to fire than modern semi-automatic pistols. Next up is the Spanish Astra 400 and 600. These were famously nicknamed the pipe wrench by the troops who used them. Its straight blowback mechanism had very few moving parts to break. This meant it was incredibly reliable in the dirt and sand. But that heavy bolt produced massive, snappy recoil for the shooter. It was a robust powerhouse that was hard to master. Let's look at the United States Smith & Wesson Victory model. These were utterly dependable and incredibly smooth-shooting revolvers. They rarely ever failed under pressure in any climate or condition. They served perfectly as survival weapons for downed Allied pilots. Naval personnel also relied on them heavily throughout the entire war. They were the ultimate unsung heroes of the revolver world. Next is the Spanish Star Model B. This was an excellent Spanish copy of the famous American 1911 profile. However, it was cleverly chambered in the readily available 9mm cartridge. It lacked the grip safety of the traditional 1911 design. Despite that minor omission, it was a phenomenal and reliable combat performer. German forces bought them in large numbers to supplement their own shortages. Coming in next is the German Mauser C96 broom handle. It boasted incredible bullet velocity for a handgun of that era. It also had a 10-round capacity loaded very quickly via stripper clips. It was a true legend of early firearms design and trench warfare, but its awkward ergonomics were completely obsolete by World War II. It was too front-heavy and clumsy compared to modern sidearms. Next, we have the German Walther P38. This was the absolute gold standard for compact double-action pistols in Europe. It was beautifully machined, totally reliable, and highly accurate. It performed flawlessly for high-ranking officers, police, and fighter pilots. However, its tight tolerances meant it was never meant for the brutal mud of the front lines. It remains an iconic symbol of espionage and military authority today. Let's continue with the United States Smith & Wesson M117. This massive revolver fired the devastating 45 ACP round. It utilized rapid reload half-moon clips to speed up the reloading process immensely. It hit enemy targets with absolutely incredible knockdown power. It was an absolute trench-clearing monster in terrifying close-quarters combat. It proved that a well-made revolver could still dominate a modern battlefield. Next is the Soviet Tokarev TT-33. This pistol was brutally simple, rugged, and extremely flat-shooting. Its 7.62 by 25mm cartridge was incredibly fast and armor-piercing. It could punch right through early flak vests and thick German winter coats. However, it completely lacked any manual safety mechanism to protect the user. It was a pure offensive weapon designed for a harsh and brutal war. Moving on to the German Luger P08. It had incredible pointability and pinpoint accuracy in the hands of a marksman. This was entirely due to its totally unique toggle lock action. However, it was vastly over-engineered and very expensive to machine in wartime. It also jammed quite easily when exposed to heavy mud or grit. It was a beautiful trophy, but a flawed combat tool. Next up is the Finnish Loadout L35. This was a true Finnish engineering masterpiece built for extreme weather. It closely resembled a Luger in its outward appearance and grip angle, but it uniquely utilized a brilliant internal bolt accelerator mechanism. This guaranteed the weapon would cycle perfectly, even in frozen sub-zero Arctic mud. It was arguably the most reliable cold weather handgun ever invented. Entering the top 5, next is the Polish Radom VIS WZ-35. This was Poland's totally unsung hero of the Second World War. It was heavily influenced by the American 1911 design, but vastly improved upon it. It added a brilliant frame-mounted decocker and featured exceptional factory machining. German paratroopers highly prized it as a captured weapon for their own elite use. It is widely considered one of the finest handguns ever created. Next up is the German Walther P38. This was the brilliant weapon that successfully replaced the expensive Luger. It introduced the modern double-action, single-action trigger to mass-produced military pistols. A soldier could safely carry it loaded and fire instantly with one trigger pull. It became the true, rugged workhorse of the German army on all fronts. It set the standard for almost every modern military handgun that followed, taking the bronze medal. Next is the United States M19 Weapon A1, known as the Yankee Fist. It was the ultimate heavyweight brawler of the war. It offered unmatched stopping power with the massive 45 ACP round. It was incredibly rugged and dependable in all environments and climates. It possessed a single-action trigger that remains the gold standard for shooters today. It is a legendary American icon that refused to quit. In second place, next is the British and Commonwealth Browning High Power. Specifically, we are looking at the Inglis-manufactured models from Canada. It utilized a revolutionary double-stack magazine that held 13 rounds of ammunition. This gave Commonwealth troops a massive advantage in firepower over their enemies. It was rugged, incredibly reliable, and easy to completely disassemble in the field, but the absolute top spot goes to its original creator. Finally, the undisputed king is the Belgian FN Browning High Power. It was the only sidearm extensively utilized by both the Axis and the Allies. John Browning's final masterpiece featured a perfect grip angle and a 13-round magazine. This gave a single soldier nearly double the firepower of a 1911 or a Luger. It changed handgun design forever and remains legendary in military history today. It is the greatest service pistol of World War II. That concludes our definitive ranking of every major World War II service pistol. From disastrous designs to engineering masterpieces, these sidearms shaped the outcome of close-quarters combat. If you want to see more historical loadouts and deep dives, make sure to subscribe. Let us know in the comments which sidearm you would trust with your life.